contact the Dole Institute. We'd like to encourage each of you to get special benefits and support the Dole Institute by becoming a friend. Please contact us if you are interested. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you. If you enjoy this evening's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website email. To view past programs, visit our online video archive at www.doleinstitute.org. Before we begin tonight, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the interview, we will have some time for audience questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student helper with a microphone will come to you. Please ask just one brief question. Hearing assistance is available, and we have a loop seating section at each program designated by a sign. If you have any questions about the loop, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members or student volunteers here in the hall, and they can assist. And now, please welcome Jim Maloof, President and Director of Pan Am KC.
Thank you and good evening. We had invited Fidel, but I think there was a problem. Somehow he couldn't get in the country. I don't know what happened. The Pan American Association of Kansas City is a nonprofit, all-volunteer organization, and our mission is to help educate the public about the countries of the Americas, particularly the 35 member countries of the OAS, of which Cuba is a member, but they're not a voting member. Our board is composed of some people from Kansas, including Dr. Melissa Birch, who is an associate professor of business here at KU. And on our honorary board is Congressman Kevin Yoder from the 3rd District of Kansas. And I want to give Congressman Yoder the credit for suggesting that we have such a forum. Just real quick, I want to thank two of our board members, well, 3 actually, Robert Evans, who is our program chairman and arranged this with the Dole Institute, and Tony Andrade and Diego Gandolfo for helping bring our speakers here, so we very much appreciate what they did for us. I'd like to also thank the Dole Institute for co-sponsoring with this program with us, and without further ado, I'm going to make it short, introduce Bill Lacey, the Executive Director of the Dole Institute.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you all for coming out to hear what is going to be a fascinating program on a very, very important and also timely topic. Let me make just a couple of additional comments before we start. I want to recognize some of our other co-sponsors tonight. The Pan American Association of KC, Jim represents. They actually brought this idea to us and recruited our speakers, so we're most appreciative to them. We're also very appreciative to KU Model UN, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at KU, and the Office of Multicultural Affairs. I want to let you know that Associate Director Barbara Ballard, who's a fixture at these programs, most of you probably know that she is a member of the state legislature, and she is watching over budget committee issues in Topeka tonight and couldn't be with us. And I want to thank Professor Melissa Birch, whose class at the Edwards campus is tuning in by streaming now, assuming our streaming is working. Melissa, thanks for sending Robert Evans to me to set up this program. We greatly appreciate it, and have fun listening to our discussion tonight. Again, thanks to all of you for coming out and for supporting it. We have 2 guests who are very distinguished and who are extraordinarily knowledgeable about this topic. I'm going to just very briefly introduce them, but most of you should have programs with slightly more detailed biographies that you picked up on the way in or that were left on your chairs tonight. First, Professor Marifeli Perez-Stable is a professor at Florida International University. She's the author of 2 important books on Cuba and chaired the organization which issued the report, Cuban National Reconciliation. From 2004 to 2009, she served as Vice President for Democratic Governance at the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington, D.C. She's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Frank Calzon serves as Executive Director for the Center for a Free Cuba. Frank has testified before congressional committees and the United Nations Commission on Human Rights in Geneva. His articles on Cuba have been published extensively, and he has participated in many radio and television discussions on the topic. He's also discussed the Cuban situation with dozens of world leaders. Please welcome our guests tonight to the Dole Institute and the University of Kansas. I want to start with each of you, and Professor, we'll start with you first, but talk a little bit about, describe why you're so passionate about this issue. A little bit about your personal background that relates to it.
Well, I left Cuba when I was 10 years old, and even though my life in Cuba was a privileged one, I always felt Cuban in my heart, and I feel that to this day, with the addition that I am also an American now. So I have two countries, Cuba and the United States. And all my life, I mean, I don't have any complaints about my life. I'm happy, and I have a rich group of friends and family. But there's a longing inside of me for Cuba that it will never go away. And on a personal level, that's why when I listened to President Obama when I saw him on television on December 17th, tears, my eyes swelled with tears, because something that I think will be good for the Cuban people and for the American people, finally the fever broke in some ways. And I'm very happy to be in the Midwest. I was telling Mr. Kringley, no, the gentleman who was sitting next to me at dinner. Anyway, Midwesterners of all races and ethnicities. I have a Perez-Stable family in Cleveland, Ohio. When they speak Spanish, they're very loud. When they speak English, they're Midwesterners. So I really think that every time I come to the Midwest and I see people, and I know that this is bipartisan, and there are Republicans and Democrats and independents or whatever, Midwesterners know how to be civil. And I really appreciate that, because I hope that some of the Midwestern Cubans can do something for Cuba in the future in terms of civility.
Frank?
Well, I'm Cuban, still remain Cuban, although I left Cuba when I was 15 years old, and I spent some time in the American Army. It's hard not to fall in love with the United States, the American people, if you come from somewhere where there's no freedom. My mother, I heard her one time talking to one of her little granddaughters, and I think that what she said, in a way, is something that most Cuban Americans agree with her. She was telling Bibi, who was 7 years old, who was asking about Cuba. And my mother was saying, you know, Cuba, she said, Bibi, Cuba was like a house, our home. And there was a fire. And we have to run away. And we came to America. And the American people are our neighbors. And they took us in. At that level of a 7-year-old, I think that explained very well the way Cuban Americans think about the United States. When I think about Cuba, I don't think about a geopolitical chess game. I think about 11 million souls in Cuba. And we should not forget that. A lot of the discussion about Cuba has to do with the policy, the process, and the people somehow are left out of the discussion. I have a different take on the president's announcement. I think the devil is in the details. I believe that it's too soon to have tears. I have had tears in my eyes many times when I heard that the president exchanged a man who was a spy for the Cuban government and who had been part of the Cuban government campaign to kill 4 men in the Florida Straits. People call them Cuban Americans, but one of them was born in New Jersey, had never been in Cuba. They were pilots looking for refugees. And a Cuban spy who was sentenced to a life sentence in the United States for his participation in the plotting of that killing was released by Mr. Obama and went back to Cuba, where he was received as a hero. So I think there are many ways of looking at the Cuban situation. I'm sure the Cubans who are, as we speak now, in the Florida Straits trying to leave Cuba and get to America, have a point of view. I think that Cuban Americans who now would like to be able to do business in Cuba and sell products made in Cuba by workers that would get paid about $25, $30 a month without a right of a labor union, they have another different point of view. So I welcome the debate. I think we could disagree without being disagreeable. But I also think that, as Senator Moynihan once said, we are all entitled to our own opinions, but not to our own facts. Let's talk about the facts tonight.
I think we're going to start with a point of agreement between the two of you, because I've spent enough time with you. I believe you both agree on this, and I want to just kind of put this off, take this off the table and move on to other topics. Both of you are strong advocates of democracy and human rights in Cuba. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
Sure.
okay. Well, so that everybody knows, we're starting from a very similar perspective on that. So then it really gets into the issue of how do you promote that, and what do we do? And I'm going to ask each of you to address each of these questions and maybe just trade off, or if one of you want to jump in first, that's fine too. But I won't direct them to you. But why was the U.S. embargo implemented originally?
Well, it was actually implemented in phases, and it was a policy that the United States sought to strangle Cuba, the Cuban Revolution at the time, to strangle Cuba, the Cuban economy, as a way of forcing or precipitating the Cuban people rising up against the revolutionary government in the early 1960s. The embargo is still around, and it's unlikely to be lifted anytime soon, because it now has been codified in the law that was passed in 1996, the Helms-Burton law. It has a longer, actually beautiful title, but everyone knows it as Helms-Burton. And so it takes an act of Congress. There are a few little loopholes there, but it basically takes an act of Congress, that is, to rescind the law that was passed with overwhelming support from Democrats and Republicans, because it was approved after the incident that Frank mentioned, that there was this organization in Miami called Brothers to the Rescue, dedicated itself to looking for rafters in the Florida Straits and saving them. And they did save a good many of them who perhaps would not have made it to the United States. And so the Cuban government shot them down. It created an international crisis at the time, and the individual that Frank mentioned was the lead spy. And their purpose was to weaken and frighten the brothers to the rescue. So the embargo today, it has gone through different iterations, but the embargo today is a law. And this administration or a future administration, if it so decides, can tweak around the edges, but ultimately it would have to be an act of Congress to lift the embargo.
Well, I would like to start from a somewhat different perspective. Why was embargo put in place? I think that's a question. The embargo was put in place because soon after, or about a year and a half after Castro came to power, he confiscated all American properties in Cuba without paying for them. He also confiscated all Cuban properties in Cuba from all Cubans. The embargo has gone through various, as the professor mentioned, various changes throughout the years. The important thing is that while some people say that the embargo was put in place to strangle the Cuban people, I would say that
Cuban economy,
the
excuse
Cuban
me.
economy, I would say that the embargo was put in place as a way of showing to the world that you could not take American property and nothing would happen to you. Short of doing that, I guess the United States would have invaded Cuba. Nobody wanted to invade Cuba. The embargo had a number of advantages that are usually not mentioned here. The embargo, first of all, made Cuba a lot more expensive to the Soviet Union. You got to go back to the 60s and 70s when Cuba became an unsinkable aircraft carrier near the United States. You cannot talk about the embargo without mentioning Cuba, without mentioning Mr. Castro, without mentioning Cuban armies in Angola, and without mentioning what the Cuban government has been doing now during the last few years, 3 or 4 years, when Mr. Obama has been in place. For example, Havana is right now discussing with Putin about opening reopening a electronic spy station in Havana. That should be part of American interest. While the president is standing in hand of friendship, this is what Havana is doing. While the Assistant Secretary of State went to Cuba about a month and a half ago, when she got there, a Russian spy ship was there, who left the day after she left. There are Cuban troops in Venezuela, training the Venezuelan police to repress the Venezuelan people. The problem is when we discuss Cuba, all these facts, and I'm talking about facts, this is not an opinion, either there are Cuban troops in Venezuela or they're not. Either the Cuban government wants to open up a spy station for the Russians, or that's not true. So I'm not just talking in general terms, I'm talking about very specific terms. Cuba is a close ally of the North Koreans. This did not happen in 1960, 1970, 1980, less than 2 years ago, when the Obama administration was talking to the Cubans. Havana was caught trying to smuggle on a North Korean ship warplanes, missiles, and weapons to North Korea. North Korea is not a friend of the United States. We don't understand why Cuba, at least I don't understand why Cuba wants to have, quote unquote, normal relations with Washington while conducting a very policy that is not normal. I don't hear Costa Rica sending warplanes to North Korea. So we need to look. Cuba has a very ambitious foreign policy, and no other country in the hemisphere has a more ambitious foreign policy. Cuba supports Iran. Cuba gives refuge to American terrorists who are today in the most wanted list of the FBI. So what I'm saying is, I know the president means well. I know the president would like to see a happy ending. But in order to have a happy ending, there has to be a little bit of Yankee ingenuity. There has to be someone saying to Havana, you want this? Fine, let's talk about it. But we in the United States, we would like to have this. And so far, that has not happened.
But we don't know what has happened. And because those talks went on for 18 months. And am I happy that the lead spy responsible for the 4 deaths, 3 of whom young men? No. But the fact is that in such the circumstances of Cuba and the United States over the past almost 6 decades, unfortunately, it has been a very, very full of conflict and resentment and surprise in many ways from the United States, because who would have thought in 1958, late December 1958, before the rebels before Batista fled, the dictator of Cuba at the time, and the rebels took over the island, President Eisenhower was in the White House with his advisor saying, how did it come to this? And I'm not belittling Eisenhower by any means, on the contrary. If I had been an American and of age, I would have voted for him. So it's a convoluted relationship full of mistrust. And we don't know. I mean, it's easy to say, well, Obama is naive. He got Osama bin Laden. But the point is that we don't know what has been talked about over those 18 months. And on St. Patrick's Day, last week?
Last week.
Last week, it was 3 months. And the progress, of course there isn't any notable, because yes, Cuba has an ambitious foreign policy, but nowhere near what it was in the 1970s and the 1980s. When Cuba was put on the list of countries that sponsored terrorism by the State Department, it was when Cuba was supporting the guerrillas in El Salvador and the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. And yes, there are Americans from the 60s and 70s who carried out horrific acts of terrorism, killing cops and other civilians, and killing cops and civilians. And I suspect that at some point, that woman in particular will be turned over by Cuba to the FBI. I do.
Well,
But I mean, it's not a fact. It is a fact. The point is that the relationship between Cuba and the United States, I was in a meeting in the mid-90s, and I don't know why, I'm always forgetting his name. He was the Attorney General under Nixon, who resigned when President Nixon asked him to fire the special prosecutor for Watergate.
Mr. Elliott.
John Dean?
No. What's his name?
Elliott.
Elliott Rich.
Oh, yes.
Okay. And so I was in a meeting with him and people from the Clinton administration at the time. And the very well-meaning, actually, he's someone I respect. He's going on about how many visas the United States was giving to Cubans to come to the United States and present at conferences. And he was going on, and Richardson just banged on the table and said, I want to know, and I'll use his phrase, I want to know what the hell is our policy towards Cuba. So we're at that what the hell phase, because we, the United States, we need to have a policy towards a Cuba that is not nearly as strong as it once was in the world. Yes, Venezuela is worrisome, but you can't, I mean, when you negotiate, and several people have said to me, well, you're a realist. I'm a realist. Yes, I'm a realist. In that sense, I I just read Henry Kissinger's World Order. But the fact is that we need to not suspend the facts. I'm not suspending any facts.
Let's talk about the facts.
But let's talk about the template. Because the templates that we have had in place, particularly since the 1990s to the present, have not led us to formulate. George W. Bush was, in the first 18 months of his first term, didn't change Clinton's policy. And he changed it because of pressure from Cuban Americans in the state legislature, including then Marco Rubio, today's senator, and Cuba, Miami. And so we need to ask, what the hell is our policy towards Cuba?
Frank,
Yeah.
brief
Well,
rebuttal, then I want to move
very,
along.
Very brief. I'm not going to talk about what happened with Eisenhower in the 1990s. We're talking about what Mr. Obama has announced just 3 months ago. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about conceptual frameworks of templates. We're talking about something very basic. The President of the United States has said that he wants a new policy toward Cuba. And what is the new policy about Cuba? Millions of American tourists. The President wants to go to Cuba.
They can't go because of Helms-Burton.
Well, there are lots of Americans in Cuba right now, thousands of them. That's a fact. Because the president has found ways in the Cuba policy, as well as in many other policies, to get around the law and get things done. Whether you agree with him or not, it is a fact that he has done that. So there are many tourists, American tourists in Cuba. The president wants a lot of American tourists in Cuba. The problem with that is that is not a new policy, ladies and gentlemen, because the Canadians, the French, the Europeans, they have had millions of tourists in Cuba since the 1960s. How have those tourists helped the Cuban people? I would say no. The president's policy is to have formal diplomatic relations with Cuba. He claims that is a new policy. It is not a new policy because the whole world, the Europeans, everybody else, has had full diplomatic relations with Cuba for 50-some years. It's an all-failed policy that the president wants to implement. The president wants to have trade with Cuba, loans with Cuba. The rest of the world has had that. It has failed to move the Cuban government one little piece of space toward human rights. And what is missing, frankly, from both the policy of sanctions and the policy of trying to accommodate the Cuban government is something that Nathan Sharansky and his co-author in an important book on democracy, who's today the Jewish ambassador and the Israeli ambassador in Washington, they said that in order for a people, and that's part of your question, in order for a people to be free, one, they need to want to be free, and they need to pay a price if they want to be free. Two, they have to have people outside Cuba, like many Americans who helped the opposition in South Africa or the opposition on against Pinochet. People like that wants to help them. But the most important thing, there has to be a linkage, and this is what Sharansky says, a linkage between the foreign policy of the democracies and a specific, even if small, changes in those countries. The president is not doing that. The president is saying to Mr. Castro, you want to be outside the list of terrorist nations? The president should have said, then stop helping terrorists. Instead, the president is trying to find a lawyerly way of getting it done. As we speak, there are Cuban military officers that are under an indictment by a federal grand jury that took place many years ago. Those indictments are still valid. Can the President of the United States call the Justice Department and get in the way and saying we don't want to have those indictments? Those are the facts that we ought to be talking about tonight.
Okay. Do you want a quick response? Very brief.
No, move on to your next
Okay.
question.
Thank you very much.
I love you, I do.
Can both of you just take a couple minutes? We have a lot of individuals here tonight who are extremely aware of the situation in Cuba, but then there's a lot of folks here who aren't that aware of it. Can you take a couple minutes each to give your perspective on the status of the Cuban economy and how that filters down to everyday life in Cuba for average citizens?
You want me to go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, the Cuban economy is a disaster. And it's not a disaster because of the embargo. In the 1960s and 70s, Fidel Castro was very proud to publicly say that the embargo had failed, that Cuba had a much better economic deal with the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union gave Cuba great loans and great efforts, that Cuba didn't have enough products to export to the United States because they had already set aside what they're going to export to the Soviet Union. The reason the Cuban economy is a disaster is that everywhere that you have a Marxist economy, whether it is in North Korea or in East Germany or in Poland, the economy is a disaster. That's what happens under those kinds of regimes. The Cuban government can no longer say to the Cuban people, it is because of the United States. When Fidel Castro came to power, Cuba was producing about 6 million tons of sugar a year. Cuba's progress during the last 200 years has to do with the sugar industry. A couple of years ago, Cuba had to buy sugar from the Dominican Republic. The Cuban government destroyed the sugar industry. It is the Cuban government that is responsible for what is happening in the Cuban economy. And Cuba has received, in the last 50 years, more millions of dollars in assistance from Canada, France, Spain, than some European nations received under the Marshall Plan at the end of World War II. No amount of money coming to Cuba is going to resolve the problem that is a government that wants to control everything, where the government decides how many light bulbs, how many shoes, how many whatever. It's the same thing that happened in the Soviet Union. We should not be surprised about what's happening in the Cuban economy. And the Cuban government should not be allowed to blame the United States for their own failures.
And in fact, as former President Jimmy Carter said when he went to Havana and spoke at the University of Havana, that's a fact, that in his address, which was broadcast live to all of Cuba, and he basically said the embargo is not the reason for the problems of Cuba. The Cuban economy is a disaster. It is, however, less of a disaster now than it was 15 years ago. The reason being that Fidel Castro no longer has the final say. In part, not because he wouldn't want to, but apparently sometimes, you know, he's almost 90 years old, and his mind isn't always there. I haven't talked to him or his wife, so I don't. But the fact is that Fidel Castro has never cared, even when this revolution was, as he said, for the people, by the people, of the people. I mean, por los humildes, you know, the humble people. That's what he said, por los humildes.
That's what Lincoln said. You're
But
confusing. You're going back to 1863. Forget about 1959.
No, Fidel was paraphrasing Lincoln, using not the people, but the humble ones, los humildes, the humble ones. He doesn't care about ordinary people. He doesn't. He doesn't care. And if his crazy economic policies would have brought about progress to Cuba, then he would have cared about the Cuban people. But he doesn't. There's an old joke in Cuba that goes something like this. What are the achievements of the revolution? And, you know, health, education, sports. Okay. And what are the failures? Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So, you know, ordinary people, women in particular, who have to find the food and prepare it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When you don't care about that, then you as a leader who doesn't have to face an election, who is, you know, larger than life, you can go on and on and on. So, but the policies of the, and I know perhaps some of you or you know people who do business with Cuba.
With the Cuban government.
Okay, with the Cuban government.
Uh-huh.
But the shorthand. The Cuban economy today is less unpredictable. I do not think that the reforms are irreversible, in part. I mean that the opposite, that the reforms are reversible, in part because they have been so modest. This is not China or Vietnam, where the communist leadership put the welfare of ordinary people at the heart of their power. Deng Xiaoping, who is responsible for the massacre at Tiananmen Square, said shortly thereafter, let's get rich. No Cuban leader has ever said that. They're obsessed with people not having...
With power. We're remaining in power
with
indefinitely. That's their obsession.
Yes, but then so are the Chinese and the Vietnamese, and they have gone another way. But we in Cuba have not gone that way. So I don't think that these reforms are reversible. They will go forward, but at a snail's pace. And the Cuban people need faster economic reforms.
Let me mention what those reforms are real quick.
Very quickly, please,
Yeah.
Frank.
You know what the reforms are? A Cuban now is allowed to manufacture paper flowers at home to distribute, or to film lighters, or to be a barber. Those are the kind of reforms that we're talking about. Cuba needs other reforms. Cubans are not Chinese, and they're not Vietnamese. Cubans would like to be like Chile or Costa Rica or some other democratic country. And the president wants a new policy toward Cuba, but the president is forgetting that the policy of the United States under the America's Charter is to promote democracy and oppose dictatorship throughout this hemisphere. The president is making a tragic mistake by making an exception of the Cuban government, because there will be other coups, there will be other military regimes in the future, and they're going to say, we want to be treated like Raul Castro.
By then, Raul will be dead.
And his son, who is a colonel in the security forces, like the North Koreans, would probably want to be president of Cuba. The people say when Fidel dies, something is going to happen. Why is Raul the president of Cuba? Because he is the brother of Fidel. It's nothing else. There will be a brother. There will be a son. They would like to have a situation like North Korea in Cuba. That is the fact.
That is not a fact. That is a hypothesis. Really.
That they don't want it?
You can't have that in Cuba. First of all, I don't like Raul any more than I like Fidel. But Raul created the only institution in Cuba that will survive the end of this regime, which is the Cuban military. And the Cuban military, you know, and let's just for a moment say that Cuba will have a a democratic transition, imperfect and incomplete as most democratic transitions.
Under a Castro, somebody from the Castro family. The son of Raul Castro gave an incredible interview in Greece in which he claims basically that Cuba belongs to them. It is, they're entitled to run Cuba. That is a fact. I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but I'm saying that it is a fact that that's what they would like to do. They would like to move forward and have the family control Cuba. Okay. The family controls part of the military controls the hotels and the tourist industry. That's what we're dealing with. Those are facts, Marifeli.
I teach at a university, so I know what facts are, Frank.
Well, tell me about it. Raul Castro doesn't have a son that is a colonel in the.
Yes, he does.
Okay,
yes.
And you don't think that Castro thinks that he might play a role in the future of Cuba?
He may think it, but
that's all I'm saying.
But the person I saw, the interview is in Spanish and it's on YouTube. But the person I saw there is not, for example, if you were talking to me about Raul's daughter, Mariela Castro, maybe she has more. But this man, you know, Cubans have a saying, when someone doesn't really understand too much, that they have a tennis shoe in their head because they don't have brains. You know, he just does not seem to me to be a person who understands reality. And I don't think that...
Like Fidel.
Well, Fidel is something else. Fidel is something else.
I think it may not be coming across the audience. I think you both agree the government of Cuba is not a good thing for
No,
Cuban
it isn't.
people. So let's go on.
But it's not as bad as he was just a few years ago, according to the professors. Things are
the
moving.
economy, I said, not the government.
Okay.
Let me ask you
And
this.
that's
You've
independent
got
from the government.
No.
Ah, okay.
that was her opinion, I believe, right? Let me ask you this. With increasing investment from European countries and potentially Russia, with the the debate that the two of you have had tonight about the efficacy of the embargo, should we continue it, or what should we do about it? Do about promoting democracy?
Well, let's look at the investment issue. How does one invest in Cuba? If you think you could go and invest in Cuba like you go and invest in Mexico or Costa Rica, you're just wrong. You want to invest in Cuba, you go into Cuba, you talk to the government, to the Castro family, and you go into business with them. The idea of people say trading with Cuba. Nobody trades with Cuba. People trade with the Cuban government. When somebody wants to, from here, wants to go and trade in the Dominican Republic, if you're into electronic appliances, you find someone there who's into that business. That's the way international investment works. That's not the way it works in Cuba. In Cuba, the government controls 51% of the company. And do you know how the foreign investors, for example, a Canadian mining, nickel mining company that I'm very familiar with, when the company wants a worker, they call the Cuban government. The Cuban government provides the workers. So in theory, the workers are not working for the investor. The workers are working for the government. The government gets several $1,000s a year that they're supposed to pay the worker, and they pay the worker $30 or $40 a month. That's an outrage. I would hope that part of the negotiations, and the professor says that we don't know what the negotiations are. We know what the statements have been. We know what the president has said. We know what Raul Castro has said. That's all we have to go to look at. We know that Raul Castro wanted Guantanamo to be returned, Cuba to be taken out of the list of terrorist countries. We want, Raul Castro wants Radio Martí to be closed. Raul Castro doesn't want the United States to have programs to promote democracy in Cuba. And what do we know the president wants? The president wants to talk. The purpose of the whole thing is to continue talking.
Did you
I
talk
have
to
not heard the president say, like Raul Castro says, you must take me out of the list of terrorists. I haven't heard the United States say, when is Cuba going to remove its troops from Venezuela? I haven't heard the president say, when are the killers, terrorists, Americans who were in Cuba going to be returned? And by the way, if you want to bet, Raul Castro has said repeatedly that it's a question of principle and that Cuba will never return that terrorist woman that you're talking about that killed a New Jersey state trooper. The Cuban government apparently in those areas keeps its promises. It is the President of the United States who said that they would never return, or his White House, that fellow that was responsible for killing Americans in the Florida Straits that failed to keep his promise.
So, Frank, are you saying the embargo should be kept intact?
No, I haven't. See, that's a false dichotomy here.
Okay.
Either you're for against the embargo or against the embargo. I am for lifting the embargo tomorrow if Cuban workers had the right to organize a labor union. I am for lifting the embargo tomorrow if the United States would say to Cuba, you want tourists to go from the United States to Cuba, you must allow all Cubans, no exception, the right to travel anywhere they want. Why doesn't the administration says to Cuba, look, there is a group called the Ladies in White. It's in one of these reports that I distribute. They're a bunch of women, mothers, sisters, wives of political prisoners. What do? They get together. That's a fact. Maybe the professor could explain it better. They get together on Sundays. They dress in white. They carry a flower, and they go to church together. That's what those women do as a symbol of Cuban women who would like all political prisoners to be released. What is the response of the Cuban government? Cuban police, Cuban thugs come around, grab them on the floor, on the streets, taken to prison. Sometimes they're released in the middle of the night, miles away. That is what the Cuban government does to those peaceful women. I would hope that the president would say to Raul Castro, you want all these things, why don't you stop harassing, beating, taking these women to prison? Can we first start with that very basic premise? Wouldn't you agree with me with that?
I go back to what I said a little while.
No, would you agree with me on the Ladies
Frank,
in White?
Let her speak, please.
Yeah.
Are you interrogating me?
No, I want to know. I want to get an answer.
No, well, I would like some answers from you as well.
Ask me that question. I'll give you the answer. Ask me a question.
No, I don't want to ask you a question. I want to say what I want to say.
Well, no, you said you wanted to answer. I'm willing to give you an answer. Ask me a question.
Go ahead,
I don't.
Marifeli.
Okay. What I said a little while ago. It just so happens that on December 17th, the president did talk about the importance of allowing Cuban workers the right to form their own unions and not to have the parrot unions that the government, and that's an insult to parrots. No, parrots are smart beings. Listen, and there are lots of facts here, but during the 1970s, when President Ford and Henry Kissinger conducted a secret dialogue with Cuba for nearly 2 years, we are still finding out what they were talking about at that time. And at that time, that effort came to nothing because Cuba sent troops to Angola. Henry Kissinger had a fit, and if I had been Henry Kissinger, I would have had a fit as well. And so that sort of, the end of, since there was no President Ford was only president for 2 years. When Carter came in, he resumed the dialogue. And the interest sections were open, level below an embassy, with the assumption that there would be normalization of relations with Havana if there was a second term. But there wasn't a second term, and President Reagan became president of the United States. And so the story goes, but President Reagan also had discussions with Cuban leaders who, with regard to Central America. They signed an immigration accord with Havana. So this is not, this
Reagan?
Reagan had an immigration accord that when Radio Martí was launched, Cuba reneged. Because of the Mariel exodus and the people that the administration, any American government would have wanted to return to Cuba. The story goes on, and we are still finding out how this happened 3 months ago, and the 18 months preceding it, we don't know. And so I don't know whether President Obama wants tourists to go to Cuba, but he knows, and Roberta Jacobson, the Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere, certainly knows. I was on a conference call, that's a fact, with Roberta Jacobson, in which a woman, there were, I don't know, about 50 people on the conference call, and a woman from South Florida asked her about, that she was a travel agent, that would it be okay if she went to Cuba because she wanted to see the quality of the hotels? Her answer was, I don't want to talk about anyone going to Cuba to pursue activities that are illegal at this time. All right, so I don't know what President Obama wants, whether he wants the tourists going to Cuba. The thing is that when we say that the policy of engagement that the Europeans and the Canadians have followed for a long time, that it has failed. The only problem is that the embargo might have worked if everyone got on the same wagon, and engagement may work if everyone got on the same wagon. I have never seen, the thing is that December 17th, almost overnight, all over Cuba, Cubans were waving American flags. I don't know what the government thought about that, but there were ordinary people on the streets that we saw on television and photographs, and there were the affinity between Cubans on the island, not us here, who our hearts are also American, but Cubans on the island. They like Americans. They like Americans. And so the embargo is not going to go anywhere, but I think that this is a new reality. We have the President of the United States saying that the objective of the United States, is to normalize relations with Cuba. If we have a Republican president in 2016, that may or may not change. Because as I see it, I look at the map, there are a lot of people who are Republican in Congress who benefit from their states trading with the Cuban government. If there is a Democrat in the White House, this policy will continue. And the thing is that Jim Maloof was saying, no, the opposition in Miami. The opposition in Miami is coming from the elected political leadership. They won free and fair elections. But Cuban-American public opinion is changing. It's changing. Particularly those who have come recently, they are 80% in favor of lifting the embargo, normalizing relations, and they want they also say that they want American Americans, who want to go to Cuba, let them go to Cuba. So the reality, the political reality on the ground in Miami is not what it used to be. I'm not saying that the Democrats are always going to win, but the fact is that it is not as steadfast a constituency for the Republican Party as it used to be.
Okay, I would like to move on to questions from the audience. Both of you got to speak about that topic, and we're going to do Q&A. I usually give a heads up to my student workers and tell them I have one more question, but we're running late tonight, so I'm going to move directly to Q&A. I'm going to ask you if you have a question to do two things. One, raise your hand and try to get one of the students' attention so they'll bring the microphone to you. Number two, I'm going to respectfully ask no statements tonight. I know there's real passion about this issue, but no statements tonight, and please respect my wishes on that regards. Our audience is here to hear our guests. So if somebody has a question, we're ready to get it rolling.
You stand up, please. Okay. No? Yes.
Stand up, okay.
But you don't have to stand up if you don't care to.
The Spanish newspaper El País, in an editorial, said that the key to these negotiations, if they take place, will be the status of Venezuela in it. And I'd like your comments on that, please. Thank you.
Well, let me just say that if Venezuela implodes, which looks likelier day by day, Cuba better have something else. Is Cuba going to go down if Venezuela implodes? The scenario of Russia and China, the Chinese already traveled to Cuba in the mid-2000s, and they really didn't do much business because they didn't, they're like Americans in that sense. They have a keen business sense, and the Cubans don't pay. So if you don't pay, I'm not going to invest in your country. The Russians, yes, Putin is not an ally of the United States, and it was George Bush that looked into his heart and saw that he was a good man. So I think Putin could try and do something, but he's much more interested in what's happening in Ukraine. He's menacing Poland. So I don't see it. I mean, Cuba is not in a strong position at all. No matter how many times Raul says, we won. And when I heard him say that, I said, you won what? You won what? I don't, Venezuela is a sticking point. But Venezuela is separate from Cuba, and I read the El País editorial. It is separate from Cuba, and the Europeans are on board, even though nobody likes the sanctions that the administration placed on these people who were abusers of the Venezuelan people. But I think that that's going to be a breaking point and I don't know exactly in what direction.
Venezuela is different from Cuba, but Cuba plays a very important role in the survival of Venezuela. Cuba is right now mobilizing other governments, Argentina and others, to come to the aid of Mr. Maduro. When just let me say very quickly, when people tell you that the Cubans in Florida are changing their views and their polls and more polls, the most important poll takes place every 2 years. There are 4 members, Cuban Americans, in the House, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. No, 3 Republicans and 1 Democrat. There are 3 senators in the Senate, Cuban Americans. All of them are very critical of the president's dealings with Cuba because they claim that the president, like other people are saying now in regard to Iran, is a bad negotiator that's giving away everything without getting something in return.
Okay. Next question right here.
Oh, yes. My question is, do you have a hunch that Guantanamo Bay, and I'm not really clear of the prison there, if that's land is Cuban land, but do you have a hunch that the whole surrounding 180-degree turnaround of President Obama, which I respect may have been due to new facts that he learned, what does Guantanamo Bay play into these relations?
Well, Guantanamo Bay, first and foremost, is a naval station. It's a great base for the American Navy in the Caribbean. As a Cuban, I would hope that when there is a freely elected government in Cuba, the United States, and that freely elected government will work out a change in the way the Navy deals with Guantanamo, the way the Panama Canal was dealt with, without the fear that is real, that if the United States pull of Guantanamo, like the United States pull out of Vietnam in some places, and then the bases were given to America's enemies, I wouldn't be surprised if the Obama administration pulls out of Guantanamo. That's a great naval base in warm waters, as the Russians say, for the Navy of Putin in the Caribbean. These are not the idea that we cannot talk about something because we don't know about it. Well, why is it that we don't know about it? Why is it that the U.S. Congress doesn't know about it? Instead of saying we don't know about it, we ought to say, Mr. Obama, you ought to tell the American people what are you trying to do. Mr. Obama, you have a responsibility to talk to the American Congress and consult with them, and not simply say, well, you know, the king is in the White House and we have to accept whatever he does. That's not America, my friends.
He was elected twice.
So?
So really, I
Yeah.
mean, you know, he was elected twice.
But not to do whatever he wants. Read the Federalist Papers where he says there is the Congress that has a role to play. I mean, your idea that if a president doesn't care about telling the American people what it is that he's doing, that we cannot talk about it. Look, we're not in Cuba, Marifeli. I'm sorry.
Oh, I know. I'm very
all-
thankful.
In all fairness, we don't have time to debate the Federalist Papers tonight, but Marifeli, please go right ahead.
Look, Guantanamo, when naval power was the power, Teddy Roosevelt was very right on the mark when he wrote about this. Guantanamo was a land leased by Cuba to the United States when the United States was still in Cuba, and the agreement is in perpetuity, and the United States was paying Cuba $2,000 a month, which was a lot of money at the time, and since 1959, the Castro government has not accepted that. So Obama may well try to close the prison in Guantanamo, but I will treat you to a very nice dinner if, in fact, the Russians take over Guantanamo. That's really outside of my purview, because that has been talked about, but I have not read anything that points me in that direction.
We don't know, so we don't know.
Okay, we're going to take at least two more questions. I have a question back here, and then we have one right here.
Hi, thank you very much. First off, I want to thank you for what you're doing, because it brings back memories of my dad and my aunt arguing on Christmas Eve over topics like that in Little Havana.
Who's talking?
And so my question is, though, is that those of us that have not lived through the last 55 years or so are exposed to the Cuba problem through the press. But many of us don't know, why is Cuba being treated differently than North Korea, than Iran when it's a terrorist state is no different than them? I don't understand that. Can you clarify that for me?
Yes, I'll be happy to tell you that. When one goes to the School of Diplomacy, one learns there's no same policy. The policy of the United States toward Canada is not the same thing as the policy of the United States toward Mexico or Equatorial Guinea. Each one of those countries has to be judged on its own basis. Why is North Vietnam, Korea are far away? A Russian military presence in Cuba is something else. So this idea that somebody has put out all the time, that there's something wrong with having one policy toward England and a different policy for Syria. That's not. It's very simple. Each policy takes into account. The other thing is true. The exception that is being tried now, the policy of the United States for the whole Western Hemisphere, is based on the Democratic Charter. It says that in order to be part of the community of nations in the Western Hemisphere, you have to have a democracy. Now, some people, including apparently the President of the United States, want to make an exception to that policy. So Cuba is not being treated like Colombia and other places. The President wants to say, in Cuba you could have a dictatorship. In Cuba you don't have a free press. In Cuba you could have a Russian presence. And despite all of that, it's okay. Well, it's not okay.
Look, at the root of U.S. Policy towards Cuba at the beginning, I'm sorry, but I'm going to go back to the beginning.
The beginning.
The Cold War, having a communist government in Cuba in the midst of the Cold War, when this missile crisis happened in October of 1962, that really marked U.S. policy towards Cuba. After that, what I said before about how under President Ford, Henry Kissinger launched the first real dialogue to take the policy in a different direction. So whether Cuba still is actively abetting terrorism or not today, I don't know. And I'm sorry, I'm a professor, but I don't know a lot of things, particularly when politicians are involved.
We should find out. We should find out if they are. And besides, according to the law, if you provide safe haven to terrorists, that doesn't change tomorrow. According to the law, that government, unless it turns those terrorists over to American justice, is helping terrorism.
Okay.
Now, we cannot change our appraisal of the Cuban situation every time the Cuban government wants something. Now, the Cuban government wants Guantanamo, and then we start talking about Guantanamo. The Cuban government is not a legitimate government. The Cuban government cannot speak on behalf of the Cuban people. The Cuban people never elected them. Let's tell the Cuban people, as soon as you elect a Cuban government, Washington will renegotiate Guantanamo. That's what we should say.
Go ahead, Marifeli.
Okay. My point is that the government of Saudi Arabia is also not legitimate. So
That's the model you want for Cuba, Saudi Arabia?
No, I don't want for Cuba that model. But the thing is that policy towards Cuba necessarily will be realist and human rights and democracy at the same time. You know, we cannot change Cuba. The previous policy didn't change Cuba. You know, it didn't under Republican and Democratic administrations. So I think that I owe it to what I said at the very beginning, which had nothing to do with, it had to do with my facts. My heart is Cuban.
Your facts?
My
Facts
facts,
are not yours.
Please let her
my
finish.
facts of my life,
Uh-huh.
that I don't believe you know me that well.
Maybe I do.
But you don't.
We don't want to talk about you, Marifeli, please. Please, let's not go that route. It's not necessary.
Well, you dare go that route,
Yeah, well,
Frank.
Well,
Look,
I've been a human rights activist all of my life since I was in the university. Not every Cuban can say the same thing today. There were Cubans that at some point were providing support to the Cuban government or the Cuban propaganda. I am happy when anybody now, we're not talking about what happened in 1960 or the beginning, but we're talking about now. Now, let's talk about Mr. Obama. I don't think much is, when you're talking about kissing and all that happened a long time ago. What has happened in regard to the United States and Cuba under Mr. Obama?
Let's let the professor answer the question from the audience, if we could,
okay,
please.
my point is that in my heart, I have a deep passion for Cuba and for the Cuban people. And I believe that this policy, because neither the policy of trying to overthrow the Cuban government, the revolutionary government at the time by force, nor the policies afterwards push Cuba to change. I think that Cuba is in a very weak position today, in part because Venezuela is on the edge, but in part because it is a spent government with generations of Cubans who were born, let's say, in the 1980s and 90s, who don't listen, don't care. They have ideological discourses night and day on television and the radio, and young people don't want that. So Cuba, this government appears strong, but I believe it isn't strong. It isn't as strong as its blah, blah, blah seems to indicate. And that is, this policy may be, in circumstances yet to be seen, may be helpful.
We have time for one more question right here.
Now, Mr. Calzon, you talked about earlier how you would lift the Cuban embargo tomorrow if workers were able to organize a union, if they were able to travel. Do you think that there are any policies that the U.S. can take to achieve that end, and if so, what would they be?
I'm sorry, they would be what? Any hope, did you say, or any?
Are there any policies or any actions that the U.S. could take to achieve that, and if so, what are those actions?
Certainly, we all agree that Cuba is at a very weak position. Cuba depended on the Soviet subsidies for many years. Then they depended on the Venezuelan subsidies, and now they hope to get millions of dollars from Mr. Obama that will embolden the Cuban military. What is required is a linkage. The American government needs to say to Cuba, you want these things, this is what we want. We have not heard yet one item that has to do with the national interest of the United States raised by the White House. We have heard a lot of what Havana wants, but we have heard nothing. I'm glad that you were able to be on a telephone call with Roberta Jacobson. I spent an hour with her about a week ago before she went to Cuba. What is needed is for the American people to say to the President, Mr. President, you mean well. You have extended a hand of friendship to Cuba. But now, you have to tell the Cuban government that there is a limit on the patience of the American people. That as long as Cuban women are beaten and dragged on the streets, because they go to church on Sunday all dressed in white. And you notice that my distinguished friend next to me has yet to say, yes, I agree that the administration should say to the Cuban government, stop beating those women. There's some very basic things that the United States should do. And if the United States cannot convince the Cuban government to start beating up women, then I don't know what the whole exercise is about. Then I think Raul Castro is going to continue to bring the Soviet base, and he's going to continue to do whatever he wants to do. There's no price to get paid. And any other American government would have said, we want to negotiate, all right, what is our position? And any other American government would have called on the Congress and say, we're dealing with this, particularly their Cuban-American members of Congress. Imagine if any administration were going to take a significant change of policy that impacted on the black community, and no blacks in the Congress would have been consulted. Imagine if the United States were to make a significant change as a fait accompli, having to do with the Middle East, and no Jews in the Congress of the United States who have been talked with. The president has to realize that he's not a king.
He was elected twice.
I know he was elected twice. Hitler was also elected
Once.
I mean, the whole idea that because the question to my friend here is, are there any limits on what the president can do?
No,
on his own authority?
I'm actually asking the question. Actually, the audience is asking the question. So, Professor, you get the last word if you would want to respond to Frank and also to the question.
No, I mean, I think, and I obviously I voted for Obama twice, and I think that he's responsible for part of the polarization in Washington, but the Republican Party is as well, and perhaps more.
I'm not a Republican.
Well,
I'm Cuban. I'm not. I'm
okay, but if you let me go on, please. I think President Obama has failed to deal with the Congress in political terms, but when the polarization, and after November's elections, when the Republicans gained control of the Senate, right or wrong, the president has decided that he cannot deal with the Congress. And unfortunately, it's not Bob Dole in the Senate anymore. It's not Howard Baker in the Senate anymore, and so on and so on and so forth. And on the Democrats, of course, there are the rabble-rousers on the Democratic side as well. So I think we have a crisis, a political crisis, that because we are the United States, it doesn't have the dramatic consequence that normally crises of this magnitude have in countries less powerful and less democratic, with a small d, than the United States. So I also look forward to a different president in 2017. I prefer a Democrat, but if it is a Republican, I hope that that Republican or that Democrat would come in and really try to deal with the two parties using reason and compromise.
Just let me say one sentence. And I hope that president, if he's a Republican, will obey the Constitution of the United States.
You want to respond to that, Marifeli?
I think that's in the courts, and I have confidence in the courts. Whatever the Supreme Court decides, I have no choice but to accept it.
I want to say that we've been doing programs like this for over 10 years. This tonight was probably one of the most spirited and passionate programs. And I want to thank both of you for being part of it, and thank our sponsors, and thank all of you for coming out tonight.
Let me thank you, and also ask for an applause for Professor Perez-Stable, because she has done such a great job at defending such a mistaken cause.
Thank you both.